Hello and welcome. I am Shushai Adane and you are watching Arma Media. Today, I have the distinct honor of welcoming a guest whose voice has shaped global understanding of African politics for decades. Joining me is Martin Plaut, a British journalist, an author, and researcher widely regarded as one of the most authoritative Western commentators on the Horn of Africa. Mr. Plaut, thank you kindly for being here today. It is a real privilege to have you on this program, especially as we turn our attention to the complex and evolving dynamics of the Horn of Africa, with particular focus on Ethiopia, Eritrea, and Tigray.
I'm happy to be with you.
How would you describe the current geopolitical climate in the Horn of Africa, especially between Ethiopia and Eritrea?
It's a difficult question. I mean, it's a very good question, but it's a difficult one. Why is it difficult? Well, for at least three different reasons. Firstly, because a number of these governments, particularly Eritrea, have no relationship with the independent media at all. So it's impossible to get a good understanding of what drives Eritrea. You can only speak to people, people who know people, people who know people who know people. So it's a very complex line of relationships. Secondly, the situation in Ethiopia is massively complicated, as of course you know, and as of course all your listeners know, or viewers know, I should call them. I'm used to working on radio. I was with radio for 27 years, so you must forgive me. The situation is immensely complicated. And thirdly, you have from outside the region many outside actors who weren't active as much as they are now in the past. So there's much more activity from the UAE, from the Saudis, from the Turks, the Egyptians. Everybody has got a finger in the pie, at least up to a point. And then you've got the Americans. And I mean, if you can tell me what Donald Trump is going to do, well, you're a better man than I.
What do you think are the key fault lines driving instability in the region today?
The big fault lines, of course, go back a long, long, long way. Now, I've just published a book which you might have seen reference to, which is called Unbroken Chains, Understanding African Slavery, Enslavement over 5,000 years. And so you could say, well, if you really want to go back to where all this all begins, you have to go back a very long way to see the relationships between the peoples, the way that they interacted, the way that, for example, Ethiopia sold slaves to Arabia for hundreds and hundreds of years, the way there were raids by Arabs into Arabia. Into Ethiopia, including what's his name, Gram, the left-handed. Have I got him right? Who's still remembered for his terrible raids. All of these things set up patterns of relationships. Ethiopians sent slaves up the Nile. Slaves were continued under Haile Selassie. All these things shaped relationships between peoples and continue to do so. And that is, very important. I don't think we should lose sight of that when we only go back to particular events and particular controversies. I mean, if we look at, for example, the tension between Ethiopia and Egypt and the Gerd Dam, well, yes, that is one specific example. But these tensions with Egypt, sometimes working with them, sometimes not working with them, these go back centuries and centuries. And if you really want to look at them properly, you have to understand the whole blooming lot, which makes life very difficult. And of course, we haven't, who's forgotten that once upon a time, Abyssinia, the Abyssinian Empire, stretched into Yemen and across into the Arabian Peninsula. All of these things, have a relationship and go on shaping the way in which people relate to each other. I mean, just as they do in Europe, you can't understand, for example, the way in which the Germans relate to each other without understanding, how they came out of clashes with the Roman Empire. So, I mean, there's nothing special about the Horn of Africa, but it does require a deep understanding, which I've been working on for a long time, but have I got to the bottom of it? Certainly not.
Okay, so it is already highly linked to the history of the region, you mean, right?
Exactly.
Let's proceed to more specific questions, especially related to TPLF, Tigray People's Liberation Front, PFDJ, People's Front for Democracy and Justice, which are the two vanguard parties in Eritrea and Tigray. So, following the Tigray genocide and the Pretoria Agreement, how has TPLF redefined its political identity of survival, internal fragmentation, and accusations of betrayal from within Tigray? What role might it realistically play in the future power dynamics, Mr. Plaut?
Well, first of all, I don't use the word genocide. I only use the word genocide in very, very limited cases. I don't use it in Gaza, for example. I use it only in, for example, what was done to the Armenians or what was done in Rwanda or to the Jews. I'm very careful about using it because, yes, atrocities, appalling acts of brutality, war crimes, all of those words I will use, but I don't use genocide because there were plenty of Tigrayans, for example, walking around in Addis. They had a hard time. I completely accept that. But not each of them was taken out and killed. Some of them were arrested. So I just think you've got to be very, very careful. I am very careful with using that word because it's peculiar. It's a strange word. The relationship between the TPLF and the EPLF, I prefer calling them the EPLF because, I mean, the PFDJ is just another name for the EPLF. Okay. I mean, that goes back, again, such a long time. And, you know, the relation between Isaias and Meles, which was the basis of it all, was, again, very complicated. And, you know, there was deep, deep distrust between those two movements, which take a long time to look at because they were so bitter. I mean, just to give one example, the EPLF came first. The TPLF was founded about, maybe 8-9 years later. And the TPLF only reached out to the EPLF after they tried reaching out to other movements. Isaias, of course, knew about this and didn't like it. The EPLF was closer to the Soviet Union. The TPLF was closer to the Chinese and the Albanians. All these things set up tensions. And then there were underlying problems between the two peoples when, after all, you know, there were a lot of Tigrayans who went to work in Amhara who were treated badly. For years and years, they were treated as, I mean, they were treated in the housework if they were women or as prostitutes. And the men were also badly treated. So there was long, deep, shall we say, animosity between the peoples as well as good relations. And that, of course, is the most difficult element, is that the people are essentially, in many ways, if we're talking about Highlanders, are the same. Or at least many of them. So they have a lot in common. And so there are many times when they do manage to put aside the idiotic differences which divide them, that they have no problems with each other. So but all those elements are the same. If you want to go to the current situation, I mean, the one thing we know about Isaias is that he is an absolute past master at manipulation and manipulating people, and has done this down the years. I mean, it's the one thing that he is absolutely superb at doing. If you look at the way that he related to, for example, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, used them against the Ethiopians when he was trying to get leverage over them, the way that he now has been backing, it is said, the Fano. I don't know whether that's true, but it's certainly said. And then, you know, the way that he, you know, linked up with Abiy for the war that ended in 22, which was awful. I mean, one of the worst conflicts. Who knows how many died? 600,000 is a figure that's used. We don't know. But now there's been the switch inside the TPLF, with one half going to Abiy and the other half going towards Isaias. I mean, who would have predicted that? I mean, it was completely surprising to me. But I mean, maybe I shouldn't be surprised by anything anymore.
Okay. Anyways, My very question was, following the Tigray genocide, of course, you told me that you don't want to mention it as a genocide, but okay, I prefer to call it as genocide. This is the difference
You can
between
call
the
it what you
yeah,
like. I don't.
yeah, yeah,
You're free.
yeah. So, following the Tigray genocide, or okay, brutal war and the Pretoria Agreement, how has TPLF redefined its political identity of survival, internal fragmentation, and accusations of betrayal from within Tigray? Yeah.
I mean, I don't. Let me be honest with you. The answer to that is so complicated that I'm not sure I really understand all the elements of it. I mean, part of the problem comes from the fact that the Abiy wanted the TPLF to re-register as a party. It didn't want it to just pick up where it had left off before, when it refused to acknowledge the shall we say the supremacy of the central authority over holding an election. They held an election anyway, which was considered illegitimate by the central government. So why is this such an big issue? And I think then we have to look at financial questions. And I think underneath a lot of what the tensions are that are going on now are these financial questions. So there were large assets which were owned by the TPLF, which came out of effort, the endowment fund for the restoration of Tigray, from what they sold of the trucks that were given them from the 84-85 war and the continuing relationship. Famine, not war. And they then sold these off. They built a substantial empire, both inside Ethiopia and outside Ethiopia, and they were going to lose those if they accepted that they had to re-register as a new party. So that was obviously a big issue. And there were problems with Melles's own family, who had big holdings in all of this, and that was another big issue. If we come to the current situation, and I genuinely don't understand most of what the heck is going on here, there are stories, gold being smuggled to Sudan, to Eritrea by the military in Tigray, and making a lot of money out of this. Individuals making a lot of money, and this is said to fund what they are doing. Now, all of this in a country which is so deeply, impoverished and has suffered so terribly. I mean, the suffering of the Tigrayan people was unbelievable. And I just think we have to acknowledge the appalling atrocities that were committed, most of them to women. I mean, I have seen the videos that I'm sure you have seen as well, which are indescribable of what happened to them. But there were men too who were raped and brutally abused, particularly by the Eritreans, but also by Somali troops that were there, by the Ethiopians. It was an awful, awful war, and that's why you use the word genocide. I don't, but I don't deny no aspect of that suffering was involved. But the problem is you've then left a society which is deeply traumatized, and people who are scrabbling around for resources. And somehow out of the midst of all of those comes these new building of these new relationships across the Mereb and into and across the other borders of Tigray, to try and some people find relationships with one group, some people find relationships with another group, and I think that's somehow where it all ends. But I'm sorry, that's a bit of a vague answer.
Okay, there is sometimes interruptions or disconnections of the internet. I'm sorry, but Mr. Plaut, I would be very happy if you could. If I can have clarification. You said the atrocities in Tigray do not meet the requirements just to be mentioned as genocide. You say, right? Yeah. What does a genocide should fulfill just to be called by its name, genocide? So far as I know, the international community has this or that way, or in one or the other hand, mentioned in different ways as genocide, though not yet officially declared.
Well, For me, genocide is very simple. It
Hmm.
is the intent of one party to wipe out every single member of another group, tribe, ethnic group, however you want to define them, their opponents. They want to kill everybody, not just a few, not just the armed, not just those that resist them, but every single member of that group. Now, in the case of Gaza, they've now said, oh, well, actually, it applies to subsets of that. So you might say, well, they want to kill particular groups within this wider group. Well, then it begins to stop being genocide. I think genocide should be used that when you come across somebody from an ethnic group and you have a gun in your hand, you kill them under all circumstances. So that to me is a genocide. That is when you are trying to eliminate in their totality everybody from that group.
Okay. Anyways, I would be very happy if we could have one more time in the future or in the coming recent days just to discuss on specific issues with regard to this. Anyways, now let me proceed to the next question. What role does President Isaias Afwerki play in shaping regional dynamics, particularly in relation to Tigray and Ethiopia today?
Well, he plays the roles he always has tried to do, which is to use what is a small base. I mean, for goodness sake, how many Eritreans are there in the world? I mean, maybe 5 million, probably inside Eritrea, maybe 3 million. Nobody knows. There's been no proper census. So we don't. He's used a very small base to leverage his ability to interact with a much wider group. Let's not forget that he has had conflicts with Djibouti. He's had troops in Somalia. He's fought with Ethiopia twice, at least. He's fought in Sudan. Don't forget that his forces went in and came close to capturing Sudan. He sent troops into the Democratic Republic of Congo and overthrew a government there. I mean, these are extraordinary for a tiny nation with a tiny base and a small financial base as well. So, he is capable of doing this and has done it for years. He has a network. The way it works is quite simple. He runs the country as if it was a guerrilla movement, not as if it was a nation. His ministers have no power whatsoever. He has all the power except what he delegates to certain specific individual that he trusts. And he uses that both internally with great repression and externally through agents that he places all around the world, but particularly in the Horn of Africa, in Sudan, in southern Sudan, in Uganda, in Kenya. He has people everywhere, including Ethiopia, of course. And they answer to him and to him only. He then uses the finances that he has, which he gets from some mining and from revenues from the diaspora who have to pay money to the Eritrean government, and that provides him with enough resources. The resources are not kept in Eritrea themselves. A large proportion of them are kept in other places. For example, in the Gulf states, in Switzerland, in Italy, in the United States, probably in Britain. I mean, I don't know where else they are. And many of them are not held in government accounts. They're held in the accounts of particular businessmen, but people who are loyal to him and answerable to him. And if you try to misuse those funds, you will be in serious trouble, and so will your family inside Eritrea. But then he also makes money, and this is about to come out in a court case that we expect in the next month or so in the Netherlands. He also makes money bizarrely from trafficking. Now, on the one hand, Isaias puts his army on the border, telling them nobody is to cross. On the other hand, he knows very well that his generals use that restriction to make money for themselves by taking money from local people as they trade them across the border. And some of that money then goes back to Isaias. So it's a very complicated network, well financed by all these illicit means, and spreading around the world. And they will put pressure on anybody to try and make sure that they do not step out of line. And that is the system that he uses.
The recent Ximdo or engagement initiative between the TPLF and the Eritrea's Shabia or TPLF, just name it. So surprised many. So what do you believe triggered this shift, and how credible is it as a peace effort, Mr. Plaut? Should I
Look,
repeat the question? Should I repeat
no,
the
no. I
question?
got the question. I got the question, and the problem is the answer. Because after all, what,
Mm,
2 years ago, these two groups were fighting each other to the death,
mm,
and all of a sudden there's a complete switch. So it's difficult to understand. But I suppose the basic reason is quite simple. Abiy has now come out saying he wants a route to the sea. He wants to have for Ethiopia once again to have a naval presence, and he doesn't mean on Lake Tana either. I mean, why he wants this is a bit of a mystery. I mean, I have some ideas, but nothing specific.
mm.
So he
Please.
wants that, and Isaias quite rightly works out that the obvious place to have a navy is either in Massawa or Assab, and which is where the Ethiopian navy traditionally was. I mean, you can find photographs of them. Everybody knows that. So if that is what Abiy really wants to re-establish, well, then that means taking territory or re-encapsulating or, bringing Eritrea, parts of Eritrea or the whole of Eritrea back into Ethiopia.
Mhm.
And of course, Eritreans aren't wild about the idea. They spent 30 years fighting for their independence. They lost huge numbers of people, and they're not likely to do this anytime soon. So that set up a tension between Abiy and Isaias, and the obvious people to try and benefit from it were the people who, in a sense, lost the Tigray war. I'm not saying the Tigrayans were totally defeated, and the Tigrayans, you're a Tigrayan, I presume you must know much better than I would, that Tigrayans would have fought to the end of time if they had to, against if Tigray had been completely occupied, and they would have just retreated to the mountains, to the hills, and they would have gone on fighting. So, I mean, they have Tigrayans have an extraordinary ability to last and resist whatever is thrown at them. But, nonetheless, the TPLFs, shall we say, the northern faction, I mean, to put it very crudely, they with Debretsion, they saw that their enemy's enemy was their friend. Hey, make a deal with Isaias. Why not? We've had relations with him in the past. They had meetings in the past. Why not revive those? Switch positions. And the TPLF has always been quite pragmatic. I mean, it's very both ideological and pragmatic, which may seem like a contradiction, but they've always seemed to somehow survive this tension. And of course, then that left, the people in Mekelle, the transitional administration in Mekelle, out on a limb.
Let's now proceed to issues related to Pretoria Agreement. In light of the Pretoria Agreement between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF, who do you believe bears greater responsibility for its incomplete or say its delayed implementation, and what underlying factors have contributed to this?
I mean, if one's going to be realistic, I suppose everybody has some responsibility for it. I mean, the problem was in the beginning was the actual deal that was done. The deal didn't involve Eritrea, and everybody knew that Eritrea was one of the big participants in that war. They, I don't know whether they were responsible for half of the fighting on the government side, or the government and the Eritrean side, or at least a third. I mean, they threw huge numbers of troops in, and they sacrificed vast numbers of people, which Isaias has always been prepared to do. So where does that, you know, they were not there. They were still occupying large parts of Tigray. I mean, in the north and in the west. And I mean, I don't know to this day whether they've all left or whether they have withdrawn to the international border. Because I think it's worthwhile pointing out that there are large parts or considerable parts of Ethiopia which were handed over by the Boundary Commission to Eritrea legitimately. And there were considerable parts of the border which were handed over to Ethiopia from Eritrea by the Boundary Commission. And that was the international decision.
Mr. Plaut, I'm sorry for the interruption. There was an interruption or the internet disconnection. So would you please start from, you were saying Eritrean forces are still occupying a lot of parts of Tigray in western Tigray, blah, blah. Yeah, soon as you said.
I understand. So Eritrea continued to occupy large parts of Tigray, both the west and the north. Some of those areas they occupied legitimately because they had been given them by the Boundary Commission, which was formed after the 98-2000 war. And it drew a line, and people didn't like where the line was, but it was where it was. And so there were parts of what people now consider Ethiopia, I mean, like the Arab people, I mean, are very unhappy about where they are inside Eritrea. But there are other people who found themselves inside inside Ethiopia, and they weren't too happy about it. So it was a deal. It was what the international community was asked to do, and they did a good job on it. And it is the official boundary of the two countries. It's one of the few boundaries in Africa that was actually laid down by an international treaty, and we know exactly where it is inch by inch. It doesn't mean that either side has ever, I don't know whether they've ever demarcated it along that boundary, but it is the official boundary between the two countries. And so I'm sorry, that was a bit of a diversion. But I mean, the Eritreans were inside, as far as I can tell, legitimate Ethiopia. How far they ever withdrew, I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I'd be interested to hear from you whether you think they've left the whole of Western Tigray. I don't know.
Okay. To what extent has the federal government approach to transitional justice and disarmament in Tigray aligned with the spirit of the Pretoria Agreement? And where has it most visibly diverged, Mr. Plaut?
I think it had no intention ever of bringing about any form of justice. I don't think there was any interest in it whatsoever. I mean, one of the first things that when the war began, there were reports that war crimes were being covered up, that sites were being, shall we say, cleansed to make sure nobody could find the evidence. And even though there were really quite heroic attempts to collect the evidence of what had happened, and this is continued, I think there is no interest in it whatsoever. I don't think that the Ethiopian government has any interest in pursuing that, and certainly the Eritreans have no interest in pursuing it. And don't forget that there were also some allegations against the TPLF. They weren't they were also allegations of that they had committed war crimes, and not perhaps on the same scale, but that they had.
But I want to align the federal government's appetite or interest to disarm TDF and the Pretoria Agreement with regard to transitional justice concurrently, right?
Look, at the end of the day, it's often been said that you don't win at a negotiation what you have not won on the battlefield. And Tigray was in a weak position when it had to sign that agreement. And therefore, it had a lot of things imposed upon it. And although there were elements that talked about justice, the much stronger element was about disarmament. And certainly, as far as I can tell, the the Tigrayan forces did disarm or gave away quite a lot of their military hardware. Now, whether they gave away everything or whether they kept quite a lot of it back, I would be surprised, given Tigray's history, if they gave back everything. That would be absolutely astonishing. I don't think that's the way things operate. But they certainly gave a lot of things back. But they were never going to get the justice they were promised. It's as simple as that. It was always a fiction. I mean, you can sign up to anything you like. You know, I mean, it's just the way things work.
Do you believe the Pretoria Agreement has exacerbated political fragmentation between the federal government and the Tigray's regional leadership? If so, what mechanisms within the deal or failures in its implementation have contributed most to this divide, Mr. Plaut?
I don't think we should look too hard at the agreement. The agreement was just one point in time. I mean, what caused the fragmentation inside Tigray? If we're just looking at Tigray, and I mean, you know, other people have fragmented as well. I'm not trying to suggest that. I mean, look at the fighting between the Amhara and the federal government now, which is bitter. So I mean, it's not just Tigray that has had this problem. Other people have had as well. But the you know, the forces which led to the fragmentation were not the Pretoria Agreement. As I say, the Pretoria Agreement was just one moment. The fragmentation came from really serious questions which were asked quite rightly by the people of Tigray, of their own government, their own administration, about how they ran the war. And, you know, were the right decisions taken? Now, when it was a war, if you're a soldier, you have to obey. Well, you can be shot. But I mean, you know, you have to obey. And, you know, people were behind their own troops. They worked as hard as they possibly could. I mean, the advance that sort of led almost to, I've forgotten what the tunnel's name is, that leads down to Addis Ababa. And they couldn't continue any further. And they were under huge pressure from the Americans to retreat. And they did. They pulled back for over ground that they had lost thousands of troops, you know, taking, and it was a terrible withdrawal, and you know, must have been deeply distressing for those people who had sacrificed their friends, their brothers, their sisters, you know, taking that ground, and you know, then so when the war was over, you know, the troops, like everybody else, began to say, well, what the hell were we doing? Why did we go all that way south and then all the way to pull back? What was the strategy? And people began asking questions, and they also asked questions about the legitimacy of the TPLF itself, which has always been said to manipulate elections. I mean, some of the elections are completely legitimate. I'm not suggesting they aren't, and I'm not suggesting the TPLF wouldn't have won the elections they did, but the opposition forces have always said, look, it's manipulated, it's not fair, they use government resources, etc., etc. So, you know, as soon as the war was over and people could breathe a little bit, they were going to begin asking questions of their own government. I think that led to the fragmentation. And then you get Abiy coming up with his, I think, completely crazy scheme to want to, you know, to have a navy and take parts of the Red Sea. You know, which was always going to be, I mean, how on earth could Isaias possibly agree to that? I mean, you know, it was just, it couldn't be accommodated. Well, that was going to set up cracks and fissures and differences between the different elites. That's what we see now. And, you know, so all of these things, plus, as I mentioned, the issue of the financial questions, the issue of gold, these all come together and they produce a mess.
Okay, Prosperity Party has positioned itself as a unifying force. So how effective has it been in managing Ethiopia's ethnic federalism and regional tensions?
When Abiy began, he was certainly popular, and it was popular amongst quite a large group within the Oromo, although never all the Oromo, and amongst some of the Amhara, although again, never all the Amhara, and those were his base. But he's gradually, that has been eroded and eroded, and now he's left with a very small residual group who support him, because after all, even if so we say that the administration of Tigray, some of them support Abiy. Sure as hell, most of the people in Tigray, I don't think, love him for what he did to them. The people of the Amhara, now many of them loathe him because of what he's done, and the bitter fighting that there's across the Amhara. The Oromo are so fragmented, it's difficult to say anything about them. I don't know where the Somalis fit into all of this, you know. So, I mean, you can go on and you can go on and you can go on. I mean, you know, Ethiopia is one of the most complicated countries in Africa. What, 80, 90 different ethnic groups, all of which, and this all comes back to Menelik the second and his extension of the you know, from Abyssinia to Ethiopia. When they took the, you know, treble the size of the country, like all imperial powers, you then discover that you have to deal with lots and lots and lots of different people. I mean, Britain faced this problem for years, of course, with its own empire, and eventually gave up and left. You know, I'm certainly pleased about that. I was never in favour of the empire, but then, you know, it wasn't up to me, and I don't think I was even around when most of it happened. So, but, you know, you see the consequence of holding on to different groups who, of course, have their own legitimate grievances, and they feel that they are, in the end, always manipulated from Addis, or by people who the Addis puts in place. So I think the Prosperity Party hasn't really changed very much. I mean, after all, the ethnic federalism was a nice idea, and I mean, I actually had the honor and the pleasure of meeting Meles. I mean, he was certainly one of the most extraordinary people I have ever met. I mean, such a brilliant man. I mean, if I may just go into a very small divergence, my wife did the Open University, an Open University MBA. Her tutor had tutored Meles the year before, or 2 years before, and he said they had never come across anybody who was as brilliant as Meles was. Does that mean that he was right about things? That's a different question, but absolutely brilliant man, and capable of seeing things. I mean, when I used to sit down with him, and I only did it a few times, but I mean, he always pretended he has as much time as he never called an interview to an end. I always had to say, well, thank you, I'm going. And he would answer any question. In fact, he looked slightly bored because he knew what you were going to ask him before you even asked it. So he was just the most extraordinary figure. This, as I say, this doesn't mean that he was right about things. And the system of ethnic federalism that he brought in was, of course, not as federal as it looked. I mean, the TPLF always made sure that they had local people who fitted what they wanted in the area. You know, they put forward certain people who were, you know, sympathetic to their position. And so there were always a lot of people who always thought that ethnic federalism was a fake. So when it's been scrapped now, well, what has really been scrapped? I don't know. And you know, I don't know how things have changed. And I mean, I'm sorry, I'm not in Ethiopia. I haven't been allowed to come to Ethiopia for many years. I wish I could. I love Ethiopia. But you know, I'd have to be on the ground to speak to people before I could answer that question properly. I apologize.
Okay, it's okay. Fano's rise in Amhara has drawn. Of course, you tried to touch Fano previously, but now let me ask you a very specific question connected to Fano. Fano's rise in Amhara has drawn attention. So how do you interpret the nature and implications of its emergence, Mr. Plaut?
Well, I suppose it's not any different from any of the other movements that have emerged out of regional forces across Ethiopia. You know, the government can almost always control the the center of a region, or they can have a relationship with people who administer it. And when they do so, well, then people who are not included in that find an alternative way of representing themselves. And the Fano are exactly that. Now, of course, they did participate, and they did have fighters who were armed by Abiy during the war against Tigray. They got a lot of assistance from him at that time, and it was said that they got assistance from Isaias. And so, you know, that's how they began to grow. But after Abiy had dealt with Tigray as far as he was concerned, then of course they were the next in line, because they were by this time a powerful force, and he was trying to extinguish them and didn't like an alternative power source within Ethiopia.
What lessons can be drawn from international media coverage of the Tigray genocide, of course, and how can Western journalism better represent conflicts in the Horn of Africa, Mr. Plaut? This may be our final question.
Well, first of all, I think that the lack of coverage of the Tigray war, what you call the genocide, was absolutely appalling. And you know, there's no excuse for it. I mean, there were very good reasons for it. I mean, partly it was due to the fact that Eritrea never allows anybody in except in the most exceptional circumstances. Ethiopia prevented international journalists getting to the front. Now, I do know that some journalists managed to get through, and a very few, maybe 3, maybe 4, did actually send back reports and did report as accurately as they could from the areas that they managed to get into. But you know, the Tigrayan media did an excellent job in providing their own alternative source of information to the outside world, which was picked up. I mean, not all the time, but from time to time it was picked up, and stories did come out, and I certainly did my very best to follow it. I had good friends inside Ethiopia who helped me, and that's how I ended up writing a book about it. Not really because it was, you know, going to be the best book, but because the whole my aim was to capture the information that we had when the war ended. Because I remembered when we had the 98 to 2000 war, a few years later, I thought, well, I'll go back and have a look at it. All the sources that we had at that time had vanished. Literally, they just disappeared. So I thought, let's hang on to what we have, write it as best we can. It doesn't mean that it's right, but it's at least one source. People can then write a much better one. And you know, the whole point about writing about current affairs and about history is to write an attempt. That's all it ever is. You never write the definitive text. Everybody has the right, and I think academics have the duty to question, to ask, to probe, to go on saying, you've got that wrong, you've made mistakes. And that is the only way that we ever make progress in the social sciences. But, you know, I'm myself a South African by origin. This is where this is from near Cape Town. That's where I used to go fishing and bathing. But, you know, coming to Ethiopia and the Horn of Africa was, for me, the most exciting thing I ever did in my life. You know, I went into Eritrea twice during the war, the War of Independence. I saw parts of it which, like Keren, for example, and Nakfa, which I would never have seen under other circumstances. I began to learn a little bit about the Horn of Africa and its complexity and the marvelous nature of its people. I mean, I do think that your greatest resource are your people, and the depth of the culture that there is in the Horn of Africa is unsurpassed, you know, anywhere else in the world. I think you have a marvelous culture and a marvelous heritage, and an equally a terrible, terrible history and heritage, because it's the past that both is the you know, the base from which you can grow, but it's also the base from which you can grow all these divisions. Both things I think are true, but I have the greatest respect for for the people, the history, the nature, the land. I hate wars of every description. I think they are absolutely appalling. And, you know, I would only appeal to people to look at the way in which young French and German people walk across their border when they killed each other in their millions in 2 world wars. Today, nobody even cares where the border is. Nobody cares what the differences are. Yeah, they go and talk to each other. They play with each other. They, you know, make fun of each other. It's a much better relationship. And I would only beg people in the Horn of Africa to try to find ways out of it. And you know, it will only come from people themselves. It won't come from outside agencies.
How do those external actors you were mentioning, such as Saudi, UAE, Turkey, Qatar, and blah blah, influence political outcomes in Ethiopia and Eritrea today?
Well, they will all pursue their own interests, or let's be honest, the interests of their elites, not the interests of their people. I mean, most countries pursue the interests of their governments or their elites or whatever. So, I mean, you know, the UAE has pursued a war with using the RSF in and the Janjaweed in Sudan. I mean, for their own ends, because they want to gain access to land, and they want to gain access to the gold, and they don't do it because they love you. And the same is true. You know, the Saudis are always more cautious, but they also pursue their own ends. You know, why not? Turkey wants to extend its what it once had with the Ottoman Empire all the way down to Somalia, if they possibly could. They won't do it, but I mean, that's their objective. The Russians would like to have a base in Eritrea, and the Americans would like one too. Funnily enough, Isaias always promises them both that he's thinking about it. He never finishes that thinking. It's quite funny. They both thought they were going to get bases, and they somehow never quite have. So, I mean, the one thing one could say about Isaias is how immensely shrewd he is in playing people off against each other. What will happen when he dies? And I mean, even Isaias is not immortal. He will die. I mean, it's said that he is grooming his son. Will his son hold it together? Lord knows. I have no idea. I mean, there's such loathing between the different generals and members of the armed forces. They hate each other and have to work with each other. And so it's terribly bitter. I don't know. I don't predict the future.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Plaut, for sharing your insights and experience with us. Your reporting and analysis have helped shape international understanding of the Horn of Africa. And it has been a privilege to hear your perspective today. Before we wrap up, is there anything you would like to add, perhaps a final thought or a reflection on the region, or something we haven't touched that you feel deserves attention, Mr. Plaut?
Not really, except to say what respect I have for the region and its people, and that will never change. And people have attacked me as if I was working for either the Tigrayans or the Eritreans or the Amhara or the CIA or the Russians or the Chinese or anything else. I don't. I mean, I like the people. I think they're fantastic, and you know, have depths of understanding, which and I will never get. I will never be an Ethiopian. I can only possibly be somebody who stands at the very foothills of understanding. But I wish people well, and I wish them peace. But that's been there hasn't been too much of that in the last few years.
Okay. Thank you once again for being with us. We appreciate your time and your continued commitment to covering the complexities of African politics with clarity and the depths. Mr. Plaut, I thank you very much. This was all about what I had for today. See you again in the next episode, Mr. Plaut.
Thank you. Thank you very much.